Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Friday, March 14th, day 525 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. Happy Purim, and thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Happy Purim. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, and we do hope for a joyful holiday, but we are here for a quick news update concentrating mostly on the hostage release ceasefire negotiations. And following our briefer daily briefing, there will be a full episode of our new series, The Friday Focus, with our diplomatic reporter, Lazer Berman. So stay tuned for that after our talk with Jacob. Now, Jacob, although Purim is largely a holiday of revelry, the plight of the 59 hostages still in Gaza is not far from Israelis' minds. And school children across the diaspora, mostly in Israel, came to school yesterday wearing Batman costumes in honor of the slain Bibas boys, Kfir and Ariel. And last night, thousands came to Tel Aviv's Hostage Square for the Purim Eve reading of the Book of Esther. The gathering included Israelis from different communities, sectors, and denominations, and included a call for the release of the 59 remaining hostages in one go. But that really doesn't appear to be the proposal on the table currently. And what we're hearing from Doha seems to be a revision to the previously suggested Witkoff proposal, which was, to remind our listeners, 10 living hostages for 60 days of ceasefire. And now we're hearing about a new outline to extend the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip by several weeks in exchange for Hamas releasing 5 living and 10 dead hostages. But Jacob, before we get into the real nitty-gritty of the proposal, what is the current status of the talks? Are they ongoing in Doha?
They are ongoing. There's still an Israeli delegation there. There's a Hamas delegation there. But the Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoy, who has been the main architect of this round of talks, is actually he's left Doha and he's continued on to Moscow, where he's dealing now with another ceasefire that he's trying to put together between Russia and Ukraine. And he's obviously staying in touch with the negotiators from abroad, and they're trying to continue. There's CIA station chiefs that are involved from the U.S. side of things, but he is moving on.
Okay, so CIA station chiefs are involved, but the real question many are asking after the fiasco, what we consider, Israelis consider a fiasco of the direct negotiations with Hamas, is Adam Boehler, the U.S. envoy for hostages, also involved at this point?
So not so much, and I don't think it's because of how some in the Israeli media are trying to frame it, which was that he has been sidelined by Steve Witkoff or others in the administration over their perceived frustration with his handling of those talks. My understanding, speaking to a very senior U.S. official involved, is that that's not what happened. They tried this direct talks channel with Hamas that Boehler led. That's really within Boehler's mandate. His job is to get American hostages out everywhere, around the globe. And he's focused on the American hostages in these talks. He met with Hamas several times, and most recently on last Tuesday. But those didn't really bear fruit. So now we're back to the indirect channel that's more led by Witkoff, and you have the Qatari and Egyptian mediators talking between the U.S. and Israel to get to Hamas. So that's where we're back at. If these talks don't succeed, my understanding, speaking to this U.S. official, we could again try the Boehler route. Maybe Witkoff would be more involved this time and actually be the one to meet with Hamas officials. And there is going to be a lot of pressure. There already has been. Ron Dermer, who is the Israeli negotiator, he's been pressuring U.S. officials to sideline to Boehler. And I think that was people in that orbit were trying to push that story as what happened. My understanding is that's not the case. But basically, we're back with Witkoff right now, and the hope is obviously that it succeeds.
So as I mentioned, the initial reports that we heard of the Witkoff proposal was for 10 living hostages for 60 days of ceasefire. Now we're hearing about 5 living hostages and 10 remains of hostages for an unknown number of ceasefire weeks. But how did this evolve, essentially? That is quite a shift, and for Israelis, quite a blow.
I think the reality is sinking in that Hamas has said from the get-go that it's willing to release the remaining hostages through the framework that was already agreed upon by both Israel and Hamas. In January, you had a three-phase, basically, framework, and the second phase was supposed to see the release of the remaining living hostages, with there are roughly 24 there right now. And that phase requires Israel to withdraw completely from Gaza and agree to a permanent end to the war. And this is something that the prime minister and his coalition are very much against, and said that from the beginning. But I guess the hope was, let's get to phase one and we'll negotiate phase two later on. But first, let's get those first 33 hostages out. And now we've done that, we're now seeing, not too surprisingly, his unwillingness to abide by those terms regarding phase two. And so Witkoff is trying to put together a new framework that will keep the parties at the table and keep the ceasefire going. But Hamas has made clear that the idea of just releasing hostages without guarantees to get an end to the war is not very realistic. So Witkoff's tried with 10, which I guess would be very ambitious, because that's giving basically half of the leverage that Hamas has right up front. That didn't succeed, so now he's lowering the number to 5. And the hope is that Hamas doesn't want to return to the war, that Israel's putting on the military pressure, or the threat of military pressure, that has withheld aid, cutting off a major electricity source to Gaza, that will maybe squeeze them to a point where during Ramadan they'd rather not have a return to the war, so maybe they'll agree to give up 5 hostages in order to get there. But again, until now, Hamas has been saying from that, and they haven't really changed their position, that we are willing to release hostages according to the framework that we agreed to before, not anything else.
Yeah, and obviously that would be a win to the war for Hamas if we were to proceed to phase 2, which is essentially Israel withdrawing. And so we are really at loggerheads right now.
Well, I think that there is an interpretation that Hamas wins the war if it survives, but I think it's surviving in a very different scenario than it was in the past. And I think that's a reason why, at least in the security establishment, and to a degree, even most Israelis, according to most polls, that suggest that the majority are prepared to end the war in exchange for the release of all of the hostages. Because Hamas is in a different state, and we have the Arab world that's willing to help us at least try to sideline them a little bit more. But yes, it's more than what we were willing to give Hamas, or at least in this government, in the past few months. This is not what we wanted to get to be at, but this is where we are.
Listeners, for more on this situation, please check out my What Matters Now conversation with philosopher Micha Goodman, who frames all of this in really compelling terms. So sometimes terms become basically archetypes, and one of these archetypes is the two-state solution. And this is something that is so hot button ever since it was formed, I guess, during the Oslo Accords, this formation of two-state solution. But currently, almost nobody in Israel believes it could occur, and it's sounding increasingly that nobody on the Palestinian Authority side believes it can occur as well. You were recently in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority, and you spoke with a really high-up Palestinian Authority official, Jibril Rajoub, who's the Secretary General of Abbas's Fatah party. That's Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. So if they're not on board with a two-state solution, which has been definitely a flagship of all of their platforming and all of their, foreign policy through the entirety of the Palestinian Authority. What is the alternative now, as far as Rajoub can see?
So it was an interesting interview. I think on the one hand, he's saying that Abu Mazen is the last Palestinian leader that will support a two-state solution. On the other hand, he's seen as a successor. He didn't want to be called a successor in the interview because that kind of hurts his chances with maintaining good ties with Abbas. But he himself remains committed to a two-state solution. So there was a little bit of dissonance there. But I guess you could argue that those who no longer want a two-state solution will just push for a one-state scenario where Palestinians get equal rights, even if it's under an Israeli government. Now, that would also likely mean that there wouldn't be a clear Jewish majority anymore, and I think that's why there are lots of advocates still for a two-state solution in order to avoid that scenario. But it's still notable that despite the decreasing support for a two-state solution over the years, it still seems to be getting the plurality on both sides, that there's no other scenario that people prefer more. We are seeing, as I just mentioned, an uptick in the one-state scenario from both sides. On the Israeli side, more is still not necessarily giving equal rights to Palestinians, whereas the Palestinian one-state vision has equal rights, and it's more of a state for all of its citizens, what you hear from some of the members of the Arab MKs in the Israeli parliament talk about. So that's, I guess, the scenario that they envision in this scenario, if the two-state solution doesn't work. But I think what Jibril Rajoub was trying to do in this interview was add a little bit of urgency to the Israeli political discourse that Abu Mazen isn't perfect, and he's rejected two-state solution scenarios in the past. But if you don't try to work with him now, it's likely that it will be much harder to find another leader in the Palestinian movement who is as moderate as Jibril Rajoub says that Abbas is. So that was, I guess, the crux of the interview.
And how old is the young Rajoub as opposed to the very spry Abbas?
So the spry Abbas is just 90 and Rajoub is just 71 years old. And I think what makes him unique is that he does have some of the support of the younger Palestinian factions and representatives. And I think that's what puts him in a slightly better position to maybe succeed Abu Mazen one day. But really, it's kind of a crapshoot. And he is calling for elections to be held, and that would allow Palestinians to decide for themselves.
Wow. Okay. Lots to unpack here, and I'm sure we'll discuss this in the future, Jacob. In the meantime, I wish you again a happy Purim Sameach, and I hope to speak with you soon again.
Yes, thanks, Amanda. Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. So listeners, stay tuned for another installment of our new series, The Friday Focus with Lazer Berman. And in the meantime, I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom as well. Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Today is Friday, March 14th, day 525 of the war. Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our star diplomatic reporter, Lazer Berman. Lazer, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hello, good to be here on this fast day, but I'll try to pull through.
That's right, everyone. We are recording on Thursday because tomorrow is a holiday, and that is actually going to be the focus of our Friday Focus this week. The holiday is, of course, Purim, and the story of Purim takes place in ancient Persia in about the 4th century BCE, right about 50 years after the first temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. So Jews at that time were the subjects of the vast Persian Empire, which extended over something like 127 lands. Essentially, in the story, which is recounted in the Book of Esther, evil Haman, who was an advisor to the king Ahasuerus, convinced the king to agree to have all the Jews of his empire be killed, but the plot is foiled by Queen Esther, who is a secret Jew, and her wise cousin Mordechai. So today, we're going to talk about historic relations between the formerly Persian Empire, Iran, and the current Jewish state, Israel. All this and much, much more when we're back. Okay, Lazer. So yet again, I am here for my private tutorial on basically diplomatic ties throughout the region. And this time we're going to focus on Iran. So Israel and Iran, the state of Israel and Iran, did actually have diplomatic ties for decades, in fact. And you were telling me off mic before we started recording that even into the 1980s, there were unofficial ties. So let's talk first of all about the status of ties between the nascent state of Israel and Iran.
Sure. They weren't especially deep, and where Iran's main involvement in the region was, they were on the team of 11 countries that was set up by the UN to decide what to do with the British mandate for Palestine. 8 of those countries voted for partition plan, and Iran voted against the partition plan. What they wanted was a federal state with Jewish and Arab areas. So they were against voting for a Jewish state. However, they became, after Turkey, the second Muslim state to recognize Israel, and that set off an era of steadily growing relations. Initially, relations were not especially deep, But in the 1950s, after the Shah returned to power after a 2-year revolution, the David Ben-Gurion understood that Israel needed to develop relationships with non-Arab players, especially on the periphery of the Arab world. That's called this periphery alliance. So that obviously countries like Turkey were in that, Ethiopia, people like the Kurds in Iraq, but Iran became a very important piece of that puzzle. Now, for Iran, a big part of it was concern after 1956, which was the war between Israel, France, and the UK and Egypt. And that was the rise of this Nasserist movement named after the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser. And there was a fear from Iran that this would lead kind of this pan-Arab nationalist movement that could really threaten Iran's interests. And there was also a fear from Iran that the Soviet Union, the Russians are a traditional enemy of Iran, would start to push down into Iran and perhaps even invade. So for all of these reasons, it made sense for Iran to start to develop a very close relationship with Israel. And also, they wanted to be closer and closer to the U.S., and they saw a relationship with Israel as their way into the halls of power in the U.S. Perhaps they kind of overestimated Israel's influence there, but I think that was very much part of the calculation.
I mean, both of our peoples are very old historical peoples, very proud of our heritages. And this is actually similar to what we discussed last week very briefly with the Egyptians. We're very strong peoples, strong in our heritage, proud of our heritage. And one of our listeners who heard earlier in the week that we were going to be discussing this topic, her name is Melissa Aniskoviec, please forgive me if I screwed that up. A lot of consonants there all in a row. In any case, she wrote and she wanted to actually throw out that many of the Iranians that she's meeting this year are actually at pro-Israel protests. The peoples themselves had and perhaps still have an affinity to each other. So let's talk about where things went awry, where and when, essentially.
Sure. So throughout the 60s and 70s, Iran and Israel cooperated on a number of initiatives. We've talked in the past about their cooperation in delivering weapons to various Israeli proxies, Israeli allies in the region. One of those was Christians in Lebanon. They cooperated a little bit in Yemen as well, but the big one was supporting Kurdish rebels in northern Iraq against Iraq. Iraq was the big enemy of both. Iraq, of course, sits on Iran's border and was developing over the years a very capable military. And for Israel, the idea was to bleed the Iraqi army as much as possible to keep them occupied so they can't deploy to fight in future wars against Israel. That didn't really work. They did come and they did fight in large numbers against Israel in the 1973 war, but that was the idea. That was certainly a place where they cooperated. But in general, you had hundreds of Israeli families permanently stationed in Iran. You had the Shah flying as well and meeting Israeli officials, and you had Israeli officials in Iran all the time. You had what was effectively an Israeli embassy. I believe it never was given that full status, but it was a diplomatic mission that was very active. The Savak, which is the intelligence service under the Shah, was trained very heavily by the Mossad as well. So, these ties went in very deep, had very deep roots in terms of security. But another important place where that were very important for Israel was in terms of oil. Israel was under a boycott from the Arab countries. That's where a lot of the oil comes from, as we know. But Iran is also an oil power, and there were regular shipments going back and forth. And there was even a pipeline built from Eilat to Ashkelon, which was built to carry Iranian oil from the Red Sea and then be unloaded onto tankers in the Mediterranean and go from there to Europe, which, of course, allows it not to have to rely on the Suez Canal. Egypt and Iran are historic rivals. That pipeline still exists, by the way. It can flow in either direction. Sometimes it's been used to bring European natural gas, or I believe oil actually, to the Red Sea. So that can go in both directions. And Iran actually has claims on that because they say that they are owed a lot of money from Israel after ties fell apart in 1979. They actually won a court case in 2015 in Switzerland where Israel has to pay them over $1 billion on what they owe Iran after this joint venture. Israel, of course, has not paid, but that the oil element of this relationship was certainly very important for Israel as it was developing into a modern economy, and that was an important element. You can't do anything without fuel. Obviously, fossil fuels are what fueled the world then. They continue to. So without that, you are cut off from really developing your economy.
And if I'm not mistaken, there was also a lot of agricultural cooperation. And I know in terms of conservation of nature, there was a lot of work done between the deer species, that the biblical deer species. There's that very famous story of, I think it could be a bit of an urban legend, but perhaps it's not, that on the final flight out from Iran to Israel, some deer were on the plane and now they flourish broadly in Israel. Do you know anything about this, Laser?
I know that, yeah, indeed, the Persian fallow deer populations in Israel are from a Persian population or an Iranian population. I believe also there's in the Negev, there's this white, I don't even know what it is, this white kind of hoofed animal with big white horns called the Ra'im, which I believe the populations also were restocked from Iran.
And also dates, I think, and all sorts of cooperation that was severed mostly once the regime came to power. But what was happening in the 1980s with this unofficial cooperation still?
Well, let's get to the big break. 1979, there's the Islamic Revolution. The Shah is deposed, and it goes from this very pro-Western, though authoritarian country to this country that is based on this Shiite nationalistic fervor. Now, we think of Iran now as this country that is exporting this ideology around the region. But in the 80s, the situation was very different. Iraq, the big enemy of Iran, saw an opportunity here. Iran, the army was seen as, or was, this loyalist component of the Shah's government. So the army was purged. I think 60% of the soldiers and officers were either killed, imprisoned, or quit. So the Iranian army was in a terrible state in the wake of the Iranian Revolution, and Iraq saw this as a time to attack. Iran at the time couldn't really put planes in the air. It didn't really have many tanks that it could use to defend itself. And Israel kind of didn't know where the Iranian Revolution would go and thought that it would either be temporary, so let's maintain our ties with the multiple friends that we have in Iran, or that it would kind of hew to traditional Iranian foreign policy, which is anti-Soviet, pro-Western, and if not pro-Western, then at least anti-Iraqi. So Israel continued to supply weapons, sometimes Israeli weapons, sometimes U.S.-made weapons, to Iran throughout the war against Iraq. It was a key supplier that without it, I don't think Iran would have lasted through that war and could have really been defeated instead of coming to this negotiated end to the war. And interestingly, there's the famous Israeli strike on the Osirak Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981. That was not the first attack on that reactor. It was actually attacked first by Iran, knocked out for a few months, but that was based on Israeli intelligence, and they also gave some of their lessons to Israel that allowed Israel to successfully strike it. So there was certainly deep ties that continued. It didn't just all end in 1979. But once they won once they were able to end the Iran-Iraq war and the regime knew that it was going to survive, it could focus on other things. One of them was exporting their influence around the region and trying to protect Shiite minorities. In the 80s, we've talked about this as well, Israel was in the occupation of southern Lebanon, and Iran while Israel was funding them to fight Iraq, started backing and really creating the Hezbollah organization in southern Lebanon, which became increasingly powerful and was fighting an insurgency against Israel's occupation there. So it was kind of this strange web. If Israel, I believe, had seen any of the weapons they were giving the Iranian army being used against them in Lebanon, I'm sure they would have stopped. But that's where it started developing. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 91, that fear of the Soviets, some sort of invasion, also dissipated. So Iran really had other things they could focus on. Again, it was focusing on backing sympathetic populations around the Middle East, backing Shiites, and other, it was a Muslim, what would you call it, minority, or if they're majority, they're kind of seen as oppressed populations, trying to build ties with the Shiite minority in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Iraq. But it really was not a bitter relationship with Israel. You didn't hear Israeli leaders talking about this huge Iranian threat. The big threat was still Iraq, was still Syria. So you didn't have this bitter war of words. That changed in the 2000s.
Before we get to what changed, I just want to unravel a little bit what you just said. It's so rich, it's so deep, and it's such a huge betrayal, it seems to me. Yes, Israel knew that there was a new leadership and that they were religious extremists. Even I would assume that Israel figured that out pretty quickly once the Shah was deposed and the regime came to power. But the fact that Israel was supplying Iran with weapons to fight Iraq while Iran was building up Hezbollah, which obviously has been such a major source of bloodshed in Israel, and not to mention, just terror, sheer terror. I just find it astounding, actually, this huge betrayal. So, yes, let's turn to when Israel became enemy number, I don't know if it's number one, but became the big devil to Iran. When did all that rhetoric start up?
Yes, that was in the 2000s. And throughout, the U.S. is always the great Satan, is the big imperialist power that needs to be the region needs to be purged of American influence. But Israel certainly the little Satan, seen as America's colony in the region. That's how they view it. It really started in the 2000s. In the 2007, several things happened. You had the Second Intifada, growing series of Palestinian terror attacks against Israel. And there was a famous incident, I believe it was 2002, where Israel captured the Kfir A ship, which was a ship carrying Iranian weapons headed for Gaza, which was meant to turbocharge these Palestinian terrorist groups. They were also trying to ship weapons through the Sudan when their foreign policy is very different now then than it is now, but they were a serious part of the Iranian terror network in the region. And in 2002, an Iranian exiled dissident group revealed that Iran had hid several key nuclear sites from inspectors, which really brought this issue of an Iranian nuclear weapon and not a civil nuclear program to the fore. And that started to become a serious issue as well. And you start to really hear Israeli leaders talk much more about the Iranian threat, about the nuclear threat. And in 2005, it's the end of the reformist. There was a reformist president before, but in 2005, Ahmadinejad comes to power, and he starts to speak in a new way about Israel. These statements about Israel disappearing from the map, which start to really escalate the alarm in Israel and also the rhetoric between the two sides. And that's a real turning point as well, when it really becomes a much, much more bitter conflict.
Yeah, I would have to say that around this time, I remember I was a magazine editor at that point, and one of the covers was basically glorifying the idea that Iran was about to attack Israel with the bomb. Obviously, here we are 20 years later, and as far as we know, at least, there still is no bomb. And so I do wonder, Laser, always when we're talking about the nuclear threat in Iran, obviously it must be taken seriously, but it just appears to me that both sides have leveraged it in this very, I don't know, even in a terror kind of way, meaning striking terror into each other's civilians and citizens in order to build up their importance, perhaps on the international stage. Do you think that's accurate? Or do you think that all the rhetoric that has been happening over the past 2 decades was actually in place?
So I don't think Israel and Iran act the same. They're certainly very different entities and they have a very different logic. The Iranian regime knows that its rule is not stable. And it's stable, but the people, if they could choose, wouldn't want the regime. Certainly has supporters among some populations, but the people are sick of it. You could even say that the Israeli people and the Iranian people have a common enemy, which is the government of Iran, or the Islamic Republic. So they have to be very cognizant about the feeling of the public and the legitimacy of the regime. And certainly this fight against this Israeli threat is relevant and is seen as something that can unify the people against a common enemy. Now, it's not totally made up because certainly Israel fights against Iran and carries out operations within Iran, usually through Iranian dissidents and also maybe Kurdish rebel groups. So it's not like Israel's just sitting there quietly and is totally, a victim of Iranian threats. I do think the nuclear threat is a real threat, even though Iran, I think, hasn't made a decision to build a nuclear weapon and doesn't have one yet. But Israel has done a lot to, first of all, make it an international issue and keep it on the head, on the front of the international docket. And also has carried out a series of strikes, assassinations of senior Iranian scientists, really starting in 2011, where you have some pretty, sounds like, kind of James Bond operations, where all sorts of, motorcycles stick bombs to the sides of cars, or there's that famous one more recently where there was this AI truck with a machine gun on it that gunned down the senior scientist and then self-detonated. So the fight is there. Israel has built up capacity if it needs to take out the nuclear reactor, or the many sites. And of course, Iran is building against that eventuality. But the main threat that Iran has posed over the years, in terms of the threat that is actually taking place, is its support for terrorist groups. We know about Hezbollah and what that has become, or what it was before Israel really clipped its wings in late 2024. Obviously, Hamas wouldn't be what it was without Iranian support, even though that support has gone through its ups and downs over the years. Palestinian Islamic Jihad much closer to Iran. And then it has tried to establish terror fronts in the Syrian Golan, has tried to destabilize Jordan. So it's done what it can to actually strike Israel. And without that, we wouldn't be facing these powerful terrorist armies on our borders.
Everything you've said so far leads up to the question of what is Iran post October 7th? Obviously, Israel has already struck, as you said, and has compromised the nuclear side of Iran. Obviously, Hezbollah has been basically decimated. The Houthis, I'm not even sure what they are, and maybe they don't know themselves. It's always unclear what's going on there. Hamas is definitely not at its best, not 100% conquered yet, not 100% destroyed. And so the idea of the proxy warfare is not going so well for Iran right now. And we're now, it appears to me, at a crossroads with this post-October 7th Iran. We're at the decision, which is not in our hands, obviously, of whether there will be nuclear talks, some kind of deal, or whether Israel, perhaps with the U.S. or perhaps just Israel, will have to take the matter into its own hands and destroy the nuclear option. Would you agree with that assessment, Laser?
Yeah, so it's not that the Iranian nuclear threat has been meaningfully changed since October 7th. What has happened, and this is relevant to the nuclear issue, is that Iran's main interest was to make sure that no fighting would happen on Iranian soil, that Iran itself would not suffer any direct attacks, and therefore it was using others to fight for it. Makes sense. It was trying to damage its enemy Israel / the West through others, and it wouldn't have to pay the price for it. Now it has lost that threat. There was a deterrent effect the deterrence that Hezbollah was posing to Israel. And that was kind of a protection that Iran saw it was given itself for its nuclear program, that Israel knew that if it strikes Iran's nuclear program, then Hezbollah could open up with its rocket attack and shut down Israeli life and kill thousands, and really wreak havoc on the country. Now that Israel has taken out the Hezbollah rocket capabilities and their willingness to really do anything in the near future, that deterrence doesn't stand anymore. Israel's kind of doing what it wants in Lebanon with no fear. Hezbollah knows that it can't be shooting into Israel or it's going to suffer even more. The leadership's also been decimated. So that deterrent doesn't exist anymore. There was also the deterrent of direct Iranian attacks on Israel, which happened twice. It happened in April, it happened in October. And they succeeded in badly injuring a Bedouin girl, of killing one Palestinian man in Jericho and damaging some runways and empty runways on an Air Force base. In response, Israel took out much of Iran's most advanced air defense batteries in some key sites. So without that deterrent and without those batteries in Iran, and of course, Syria doesn't have the Assad regime in power anymore and its air defense. So the way is open for Israel if it chooses to strike. The question is, what is America's policy? What is Trump's policy? It seems to be, as with most cases, he wants to solve it by talking. He believes that if he talks to other leaders, he'll be able to solve things that they couldn't. And he sent a letter that he's open to talks. It looks like so far it's been rejected because it's being accompanied by renewed sanctions, maximum pressure. But it was very clear that the Biden administration was not going to attack Iran. I think Iran understands that the Trump administration very well could. The question is what Israel's role would be in that. I think if it happens, it would be a joint attack. Something else I should mention is the internal stability of the Iranian regime. A couple of years ago, there was the Women Life Freedom protests, which were very widespread after a Kurdish Iranian woman was killed in captivity, was taken into custody by security forces because she wasn't wearing her hijab correctly. Those have largely died down. They really never threatened the regime, but there is certainly you can tell that, the numbers of people that go to vote, there's just people are just sick of the regime. And add to that the economic situation and runaway inflation, which is probably going to get worse under sanctions. The people don't want that regime there anymore. But again, there are important pockets of support. But I think broadly, that regime is very, very unpopular and it knows it.
Yes, and you hear, of course, reports in international media of the low boil of dissent all the time, whether it be through the arts, singers, producing material that actually makes them become lashed. That was the case, I think, just this week or last, or women taking off all their clothes in order to draw attention to this really, really difficult situation that the people of Iran are in. Lazer, I thank you so much for all of this assessment, and we have just a few minutes left, and I just want you to, again, put on your chaplain's hat and really let us know what's happening in Jerusalem for this one-day holiday that's all of a sudden turning into 3, Purim Meshulash, as we call it here, a trifecta of Purim.
Trifecta. Tripartite.
Tripartite Purim. That's a better way of putting it. I don't live in Jerusalem, so I happily will read or hear the Megillah tonight and tomorrow, do all of the Purim things tomorrow and be done with it. But you have quite the slog this weekend. So what's happening Purim in Jerusalem? What is this animal?
So the fighting in the Megillah story, the fighting happened around the empire on the 14th, but it continued for another day onto the 15th in Shushan, the capital, which was a walled city. It was therefore decreed that walled cities that had walls at the time of Joshua do celebrate the next day, because that's when the Jews ultimately defeated their enemies. So usually Purim in Jerusalem comes the day after Purim everywhere else. However, Purim is Thursday night, Friday everywhere else, so Purim cannot fall on Shabbat for a number of reasons. So the rabbis split it up. They moved the Megillah day earlier, so it's on the normal Purim day. Shabbat, not much happens, but you do say the Al Hanisim prayer and you do the Torah readings and the Haftorah of Purim. And then the Su'udot, the festive meals and the giving of Mishloach Manot, happens on Sunday. Saturday night, nothing really happens except party at my house. But in general, it's going to be kind of 3 days of in costume, out of costume, drinking, not drinking, eating, more eating. It's going to be good.
Party at lasers.
And hopefully I'll be back. I'll be recovered by next week so we can do this again, but no promises.
All right, great. So I will be back in the saddle on Sunday because it's a work day for us, but I imagine you'll be eating and drinking and hopefully sleeping it all off and coming back on Monday. So Laser, thank you so much for joining me today on the Friday Focus. Listeners, remember there's now a channel for the Friday Focus, so please subscribe wherever you subscribe to your podcasts, and I'll see you again Friday, if not before, right, Laser?
That's right. Thank you very much. Happy Purim.
Thanks for listening to this week's Friday Focus. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.